They always chose the beautiful girl first, until the Ravenshire family chose the one no one bothered to see. The first snow of December fell over Ravenshire Manor like ash from a dying fire. Thin white flakes drifted across the iron gates and vanished against the black stone walls of the estate. Eleanor Whitgrave watched them from the carriage window with stiff hands folded in her lap, trying not to notice how badly the gloves hid the fraying at her wrists. Across from her, Mrs. Pembroke from the marriage agency pretended to read a letter she had already read 3 times. The older woman had not looked Eleanor in the eyes since they left London. That alone told her everything. This arrangement was not expected to succeed. The carriage rolled through the gates with a low groan of wheels over frozen gravel. Ravenshire Manor rose ahead of them, enormous and gray beneath the winter sky. The place did not look like a home. It looked like something built to survive wars. Narrow windows, towering chimneys, stone darkened by decades of rain and cold. Eleanor felt something sink quietly in her chest. She had spent the last 2 weeks imagining what the estate of Lucien Ravenshire might look like. None of her imaginings had prepared her for this. "You understand the situation," Mrs. Pembroke said suddenly, still staring at the paper in her hands. Eleanor nodded once. "His lordship requires a suitable wife." "He requires stability," the woman corrected sharply. "The Ravenshire family has endured enough embarrassment." Embarrassment, such a delicate word for cruelty. Eleanor turned her eyes back toward the window. Servants moved across the courtyard carrying crates through the snow while black-clad footmen opened the manor doors. Somewhere in the distance, bells chimed low and heavy through the fog. "Miss Hollowmere arrived yesterday," Mrs. Pembroke added carefully. "I am told she has already made an excellent impression." Eleanor almost smiled at that. Beatrice Hollowmere always made an excellent impression. Beautiful women usually did. Beatrice had golden hair, expensive gowns, and the kind of confidence that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. Eleanor had none of those things. Her hair was chestnut brown and impossible to tame in wet weather. Her blue traveling coat had been altered twice because she could not afford a new one. And confidence had become difficult after spending 24 years learning how easily people overlooked quiet women. The carriage stopped. One of the footmen opened the door immediately. Cold air rushed inside sharp as broken glass. Eleanor stepped down carefully onto the gravel. Snow crunched beneath her boots. Ravenshire Manor loomed above her like a silent judge. A second carriage stood near the entrance already covered in fresh snow. Hollowmere crest painted across the side in gold. Of course Beatrice had arrived first. Of course she had. Mrs. Pembroke adjusted her fur collar and lowered her voice. "There is still time to leave quietly." Eleanor blinked. "What?" "No one would blame you," the older woman said. "Lord Ravenshire has frightened off 3 arrangements in 2 years. There are stories. Stories. There were always stories about powerful men." Eleanor looked toward the manor again. One of the upstairs windows stood partially open despite the cold. Heavy curtains moved faintly in the wind. Someone was watching the courtyard. She could feel it. "I did not come all this way to run," she said softly. Mrs. Pembroke sighed. "You really are determined to ruin your own life." Before Eleanor could answer, the front doors opened. Warm light spilled across the snow. A tall woman stepped outside wearing a black dress so severe it seemed carved from shadow itself. Her silver hair was pinned tightly at the back of her head. Her posture was flawless. Sharp eyes swept over Eleanor once. Calculating. Dismissive. Finished with her in less than 3 seconds. "Miss Whitgrave," the woman said. Not a question. Eleanor straightened instinctively. "Yes, I am Mrs. Weatherby, head housekeeper of Ravenshire Manor." The woman glanced toward the trunks being unloaded. "You traveled lightly." Eleanor ignored the insult hidden inside the observation. "I did not wish to inconvenience anyone." Mrs. Weatherby made a quiet sound that might have been amusement. "That would make you the first guest in 10 years. Mrs. Pembroke quickly stepped forward with rehearsed politeness. "Miss Whitgrave has excellent references. She is educated, composed, and poor." Mrs. Weatherby finished calmly. Silence followed. Eleanor felt the cold creep beneath her collar. The housekeeper did not even sound cruel saying it. That somehow made it worse. Facts delivered without emotion always cut deeper. Lord Ravenshire is aware of Miss Whitgrave's background, Mrs. Pembroke said stiffly. Is he? Mrs. Weatherby replied. How unusual. Eleanor looked away before either woman could see the heat rise into her face. In the distance, another carriage rolled up the long drive toward the manor gates. A polished black vehicle drawn by 4 dark horses. Mrs. Weatherby's expression changed instantly. Not softer, sharper, more alert. The arriving carriage stopped beside the entrance. A young woman stepped out laughing softly as a footman helped her onto the snow-dusted stones. Beatrice Hollowmere. Even wrapped in winter furs, she looked radiant. Gold curls framed a face too beautiful to resent openly. She noticed Eleanor immediately. Her smile flickered for half a second before recovering perfectly. Oh, Beatrice said pleasantly. Another candidate. Eleanor inclined her head politely. Miss Hollowmere, you came after all. The words sounded harmless. They were not. Mrs. Pembroke stiffened beside Eleanor, but Eleanor simply folded her hands together. Apparently so. Beatrice's pale eyes drifted slowly over Eleanor's coat, gloves, boots, measuring, calculating value, finding very little. How brave of you, she said. Then she turned toward the manor doors without waiting for a reply. Warm laughter floated behind her as 2 footmen rushed to carry her luggage inside. Eleanor suddenly became aware of how small her own trunk looked sitting alone in the snow. Mrs. Weatherby watched the exchange carefully. Interesting, she murmured. Eleanor frowned slightly. What is? Nothing. The housekeeper stepped aside. Lord Ravenshire will receive both ladies for dinner at 7. Until then, you are free to settle into your rooms. One servant reached for Eleanor's trunk immediately. Another passed by without even glancing at it, hurrying instead toward Beatrice's mountain of luggage. Eleanor pretended not to notice. She had become very good at pretending not to notice things. Inside, Ravenshire Manor was even colder than it looked from outside. Massive marble halls stretched beneath vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men and elegant women painted in heavy oils darkened by time. Everything smelled faintly of cedarwood, smoke, and old money. Eleanor followed Mrs. Weatherby through the corridors while servants moved silently around them carrying silver trays and armfuls of firewood. No one spoke above a whisper. No one smiled. You should understand something immediately, Mrs. Weatherby said without slowing her pace. Lord Ravenshire despises dishonesty. Eleanor nodded carefully. I have no intention of deceiving anyone. Good. The woman's mouth curved slightly. Because he notices everything. They stopped outside a narrow staircase near the servants' corridor. Eleanor hesitated. I thought the guest rooms were upstairs. They are. Mrs. Weatherby's expression remained perfectly neutral. Unfortunately, there has been confusion regarding room assignments. Of course there had. Eleanor looked down the dim hallway lined with servant doors and understood immediately. Beatrice had already claimed the better suite. I do not mind, she said quietly. Mrs. Weatherby studied her face for signs of irritation. Eleanor gave her none. You surprise me, Miss Whitgrave. Eleanor forced a faint smile. People usually say I disappoint them. For the first time, something unreadable flickered across the older woman's eyes. Then footsteps echoed behind them. Slow, measured. The entire corridor seemed to straighten around the sound. Servants stepped aside instinctively. Even Mrs. Weatherby went still. Eleanor turned. A woman carrying folded linens approached from the far end of the corridor. Older, perhaps late 50s. Plain gray servant dress. Dark wool shawl wrapped neatly around narrow shoulders. Nothing remarkable about her appearance except for one impossible detail. The way she carried herself. Too graceful. Too composed. Every movement precise without seeming careful. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pinned simply beneath a maid's cap, but her posture belonged in a ballroom, not a servant's hallway. The woman stopped when she reached them. Sharp gray eyes landed on Eleanor first. Calm, intelligent, assessing. "This is Miss Whitgrave," Mrs. Weatherby said. The maid inclined her head once. "Welcome to Ravenshire Manor." Her voice was low and smooth, touched with the kind of refinement Eleanor had only heard among old aristocratic families. Eleanor blinked slightly before she could stop herself. The maid noticed. Of course she noticed. One corner of her mouth almost moved. "Thank you," Eleanor replied softly. Mrs. Weatherby gestured toward the woman. "This is Martha. She assists in the West Wing." Martha's gaze lingered on Eleanor 1 second too long. "I am certain Miss Whitgrave will settle in beautifully," she said. The words sounded polite. The tone beneath them did not. It sounded like a test had already begun. Then Martha stepped aside, allowing Eleanor to pass. As Eleanor walked toward the staircase, she felt the older woman watching her carefully from behind. Not with cruelty, not with kindness either. Something far more dangerous. Interest. Eleanor barely slept that night. Wind moved through the ancient walls of Ravenshire Manor with a low hollow sound that reminded her of distant morning bells. The small servant room they had given her sat beneath the west wing roofline where cold crept through the stone despite the crackling fire in the grate. She lay awake beneath heavy blankets staring at the ceiling while branches scraped softly against the narrow window. Somewhere far below, a clock struck midnight. Then 1. Then 2. Each hour seemed to deepen the strange heaviness hanging over the estate. By morning, snow covered the grounds in a thick white silence. Eleanor dressed carefully in the pale blue gown she had packed for dinner the previous evening but never wore after Mrs. Weatherby informed her that Lord Ravenshire had unexpectedly postponed the meal. "His lordship does not enjoy social obligations," the housekeeper had explained with clear disapproval. Eleanor suspected the explanation was only partially true. She stood at the small wash basin pinning back loose strands of chestnut hair when someone knocked once against the door. "Come in," she said. Martha entered carrying a silver tray with tea balanced perfectly in her hands. The older woman moved through the tiny room without hesitation, though the ceiling beams forced her to duck slightly beneath them. "You missed breakfast," Martha observed calmly. Eleanor accepted the tea gratefully. "I was not aware guests were expected downstairs before 8. "Guests are not." Martha's gray eyes swept slowly across the cramped room. "But candidates hoping to marry into powerful families usually wake early enough to impress someone." Eleanor lowered her cup carefully. "Am I disappointing everyone already?" "Not everyone." Martha placed the tray onto the small table beside the window. "Miss Hollowmere has been downstairs since 6:30 charming the staff." Eleanor could not stop the faint smile that touched her mouth. "I suppose she is succeeding." "Remarkably." Martha adjusted the curtains slightly. 3 footmen nearly collided carrying her luggage upstairs yesterday. One of them walked directly into a wall. Eleanor laughed softly before she could stop herself. The sound startled both of them. Martha looked at her differently for a moment. Sharper somehow. Interested again. "You hide that too often," the older woman said quietly. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "Your amusement." Martha folded her hands neatly in front of her apron. "People trust women who smile." Eleanor stared down into her tea. Steam curled upward between them. "People also underestimate quiet women," she murmured. "That can be useful." Something flickered behind Martha's expression, then vanished almost immediately. "Perhaps," she said. Silence settled briefly between them. Not uncomfortable, just observant. Eleanor became increasingly aware of how strange this maid truly was. Servants rarely held themselves with such confidence. Martha did not behave like someone accustomed to obeying anyone. Even her stillness felt deliberate, controlled. "You are studying me again," Martha said without looking surprised. Eleanor flushed immediately. "I apologize." "Do not." The older woman turned toward the door. "Most people stop noticing servants entirely after 5 minutes. You have not." Before Eleanor could answer, hurried footsteps sounded outside in the corridor. A young maid appeared breathless in the doorway. Mrs. Weatherby is looking for Miss Whitgrave immediately. Martha's expression did not change, but the younger servant visibly straightened the moment she looked at her. Fear, respect, possibly both. Eleanor noticed it instantly. "Thank you," Martha said before the girl could continue speaking. The maid nodded quickly and disappeared again. Eleanor slowly set down her teacup. "Have I done something wrong already?" Martha's gaze rested on her face for one unreadable second. "That depends entirely on what Lord Ravenshire wants." The west drawing room overlooked the snow-covered gardens through enormous arched windows lined with dark velvet curtains. Eleanor paused at the doorway when she entered. Beatrice Hollowmere sat beside the fireplace in deep emerald silk, one elegant hand resting lightly against a porcelain teacup, while two older aristocratic women listened to her with open admiration. Laughter filled the room. Warm, practiced, perfect. Then the laughter stopped the moment Eleanor appeared. The silence felt immediate and absolute. Beatrice looked up first. Her smile widened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Whitgrave," she said sweetly, "we were beginning to wonder if you planned to join civilization today." Eleanor ignored the sting beneath the words and stepped into the room carefully. Mrs. Weatherby stood near the windows with rigid posture and unreadable eyes. "Lord Ravenshire will arrive shortly," the housekeeper announced. "Both ladies are expected to accompany him to tonight's winter charity banquet in Blackstone Village." One of the older women looked Eleanor over slowly. "How generous of his lordship," she murmured. The other woman gave a soft hum of agreement. Eleanor understood the insult perfectly. Lucian Ravenshire apparently did not escort women beneath his station unless obligated. "I hear the entire county will attend," Beatrice added lightly, "which means tonight should prove very educational." Eleanor folded her hands together. "For whom?" Beatrice's smile sharpened slightly. "Everyone." Footsteps sounded outside the drawing room. Heavy, controlled. Every servant in the room straightened instantly. Mrs. Weatherby lowered her chin slightly. Even the fire seemed quieter. Lucian Ravenshire entered without announcement. Eleanor understood immediately why people told stories about him. He was not conventionally handsome in the polished way society preferred. He was something far more dangerous. Tall enough to dominate the room without effort. Broad shoulders beneath a dark charcoal coat tailored with brutal precision. Black hair touched faintly with silver near the temples despite his relatively young age. But it was his face that unsettled her most. Not cold exactly. Exhausted, like someone who had spent years carrying disappointments too heavy to put down. His gray eyes swept across the room once, measuring, dismissing, calculating. Then they landed briefly on Eleanor. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds. It still unsettled her pulse. "Mother will not be joining us today," he said flatly. His voice carried low authority without needing volume. One of the aristocratic women smiled quickly. "Lady Ravenshire still remains abroad?" "Apparently." Lucian removed his gloves slowly. "She enjoys disappointing people from several countries simultaneously." Neither woman laughed, though both clearly wanted to. Beatrice stepped forward gracefully. "We were just discussing tonight's banquet." Lucian nodded once. "Then you understand the expectations." "Of course," Beatrice replied warmly. Eleanor noticed how carefully she positioned herself beneath the light from the chandelier. Everything about Beatrice appeared calculated for admiration. Lucian barely looked at her. "Good." His gaze shifted toward Eleanor again. "Miss Whitgrave." Eleanor straightened instinctively. "Lord Ravenshire. You arrived comfortably?" Such a simple question. Yet his tone made it sound like an assessment rather than politeness. "Yes," she answered carefully. "Thank you." Silence followed. Lucian studied her for one long moment. Eleanor fought the urge to look away first. Something unreadable moved through his expression. Then the door opened again. A servant hurried inside carrying a silver tray lined with envelopes. "The morning correspondence, sir." Lucian accepted the letters absent-mindedly while continuing to look directly at Eleanor. Then one envelope slipped free unexpectedly and scattered several papers onto the carpet. The servant froze in horror. "I am so sorry, my lord." The young man immediately knelt to gather them with shaking hands. One folded paper slid beneath Eleanor's shoes. She bent automatically to retrieve it before the servant could reach it. The moment her fingers touched the page, the room changed. Lucien's expression hardened instantly. "Do not read it." His voice cut through the room like winter steel. Eleanor looked up in surprise. "I was only trying to help." "Then hand it back." The servant remained pale beside her. Terrified, Eleanor slowly offered the paper toward Lucien without unfolding it. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange. Cold, controlled. Lucien stared at her another second before taking the letter. "Thank you," he said finally, but the words sounded reluctant, almost suspicious. Eleanor stepped back quietly while the servant continued apologizing. Beatrice moved immediately toward Lucien with soft concern painted across her beautiful face. "You should dismiss him," she murmured gently. "Carelessness in a household this important cannot become acceptable." The servant visibly lost color. Lucien said nothing. Eleanor looked toward the trembling young man kneeling beside the fireplace. He could not have been older than 19. "It was an accident," she said softly. Beatrice glanced toward her with thinly veiled irritation. "Accidents reveal character." Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "So does mercy." She could see servants crossing the courtyard carrying cloaks and lanterns through the snow while horses stamped clouds of white breath into the freezing air. It was not difficult to reach. Martha crossed the room slowly and adjusted one side of the silver shawl across Eleanor's shoulders herself. Her hands were steady, elegant. Again Eleanor felt that strange disconnect between the woman's plain servant clothing and the unmistakable refinement in every movement. "Then why stay?" Martha asked. Eleanor looked toward the snowy window again. "Because leaving would prove them right." The answer settled heavily between them. Martha's expression shifted almost imperceptibly before the older woman stepped back again. "The banquet begins in 1 hour," she said. "You should prepare yourself." "For what?" Martha's gray eyes remained fixed on hers. "People with power are rarely kind when they feel threatened." Then she left without another word. The ballroom in Blackstone Village glittered beneath hundreds of candle flames reflected through towering crystal chandeliers. Warm light spilled across polished marble floors while the wealthiest families in the county drifted through the enormous hall wrapped in silk, velvet, diamonds, and carefully practiced smiles. Eleanor stepped through the entrance beside Lucien Ravenshire and immediately felt the shift in the room. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Eyes lingered. Not on her. On him. Lucien moved through the ballroom with the calm stillness of a man completely accustomed to being watched. His black formal coat fit him with severe perfection. Dark silver embroidery lined the cuffs and collar like winter frost against midnight fabric. Women noticed him instantly. Men noticed him more carefully. Eleanor remained half a step behind him, aware of every whisper spreading through the crowd around them. "That must be the Whitgrave girl. Poor thing. She looks terrified. Apparently Hollowmere is already favored. Then why bring this one at all?" Eleanor kept her chin lifted despite the heat crawling slowly into her face. Humiliation felt strangely quieter at 24 than it had at 19. Less sharp. More exhausting. Across the ballroom, Beatrice Hollowmere stood near the orchestra surrounded by admirers. Emerald silk shimmered beneath the candlelight while emerald stones glittered at her throat. She looked exactly like the future Lady Ravenshire society expected. Beautiful, elegant, untouchable. The moment she noticed Lucien approaching, her smile softened perfectly. "Lord Ravenshire," she greeted warmly. "You finally arrived." Lucien inclined his head once. "Miss Hollowmere." Beatrice's eyes drifted gracefully toward Eleanor. "Miss Whitgrave, how lovely to see you survived the carriage ride." Eleanor answered calmly. "The horses deserve most of the credit." One of the nearby gentlemen laughed softly into his champagne glass. Beatrice's smile tightened almost invisibly. Lucien noticed. Eleanor saw that too. You must dance tonight, Beatrice continued lightly. The winter banquet is impossible otherwise. I have never found humiliation particularly festive, Eleanor replied before she could stop herself. Silence flickered briefly through the group. Then unexpectedly, Lucien's mouth almost moved. Not quite a smile. Something dangerously close. Beatrice noticed it instantly. So did Eleanor. You underestimate yourself, Beatrice said sweetly. That can become a very manipulative quality in women. Eleanor looked at her quietly. And overestimating oneself can become exhausting for everyone else. The gentleman with the champagne choked outright this time. Beatrice's expression hardened for half a second before recovering smoothly. You are sharper than I expected. Most invisible people are. Before Beatrice could answer, an older countess approached Lucien eagerly. Lord Ravenshire, we were beginning to wonder whether your mysterious mother still remembered England existed. Lucien's expression cooled immediately. My mother remembers everything, he said flatly. The countess laughed awkwardly, though nothing about his tone invited amusement. Eleanor watched him carefully while conversations resumed around them. The exhaustion she had noticed earlier remained there beneath every expression he wore. Hidden, controlled, constant, like a wound stitched closed too tightly. A servant carrying champagne crossed the ballroom quickly beside them. One guest stepped backward unexpectedly. The tray tilted hard. Crystal glasses shattered across the marble floor with a sharp crash that silenced half the room instantly. Champagne spilled across Beatrice's emerald skirt. Oh my God! The servant whispered in horror. The young girl could not have been older than 16. Her face drained completely white. Beatrice stared down at her ruined gown in stunned disbelief. You careless little idiot! The servant immediately dropped to her knees, trying desperately to clean the mess with shaking hands. I am so sorry, miss. I did not mean to. Of course you did not mean to, Beatrice snapped sharply. No one could possibly be this incompetent intentionally. The girl's hands trembled harder. Nearby guests pretended not to watch while very obviously watching everything. Eleanor felt something cold twist in her stomach. She recognized that expression on the servant's face. Fear mixed with humiliation. The kind that stayed with people long after rooms emptied. Beatrice stepped backward in disgust. Someone remove her immediately. No one moved. Not the musicians. Not the guests. Not even the other servants frozen nearby. Then Eleanor quietly bent down herself. She picked up one of the broken crystal stems before it could cut the trembling girl's fingers. Careful, she murmured softly. You will hurt yourself. The servant looked at her in shock. Miss, I am sorry. I ruined everything. No, Eleanor said gently. A dress was stained. That is not the same thing. Beatrice stared at her like she had suddenly started speaking another language. Miss Whitgrave, she said coldly. There are staff members trained to handle these situations. Eleanor rose slowly to her feet. Then perhaps someone should allow them to do so without terrorizing them first. The ballroom went still again. Lucien watched her with unreadable gray eyes. Beatrice's cheeks flushed beneath the candlelight. You are embarrassing yourself. Eleanor looked down at the frightened servant still kneeling on the marble floor. No, she said quietly. I do not think I am. A heartbeat passed. Then another. Finally Lucien spoke without raising his voice. Enough. The single word cut cleanly through the tension. He looked toward the trembling servant. Go compose yourself. The girl stared at him in disbelief. My lord. That was not a suggestion. She fled immediately. Lucien then turned toward Beatrice. You should change before dinner. Her expression flickered with disbelief. I was humiliated publicly. And yet you survived, he replied calmly. Beatrice looked wounded now. Truly wounded. But not because of the dress. Because he had not defended her. She left moments later surrounded by anxious ladies offering sympathy and outrage on her behalf. Eleanor remained near the shattered crystal watching servants clean the floor in silence. You enjoy difficult situations, Lucien said beside her unexpectedly. Eleanor looked up quickly. I do not. You walked directly into one anyway. Someone needed to. Lucian studied her face carefully beneath the candlelight. You are either very brave or very foolish, Miss Whitgrave. Eleanor folded her hands together. Most women without power eventually learn to become one or the other. Something changed in his expression again then. Smaller this time. Almost hidden. But real. Before he could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance caught Eleanor's attention. Martha stood partially concealed beside the doors carrying folded coats for arriving guests. A servant among servants. Invisible to everyone except her. Yet while the entire ballroom watched Lucian Ravenshire, Martha was watching Eleanor with an intensity that made her pulse slow uneasily beneath her skin. And for the first time since arriving at Ravenshire Manor, Eleanor began wondering whether she was the one being tested at all. The ride back to Ravenshire Manor passed in near silence except for the steady sound of snow striking the carriage roof above them. Eleanor sat across from Lucian with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap while lantern light flickered softly through the dark interior. Outside, the countryside disappeared beneath thick winter fog rolling across the road like smoke. Inside, tension sat between them heavier than the cold. Lucian had barely spoken since leaving the banquet hall. Neither had she, yet she remained painfully aware of him. The sharp line of his jaw beneath dim light. The exhaustion hidden beneath his stillness. The strange way his eyes lingered on her now as though he had noticed something inconvenient. You embarrassed Miss Hollowmere tonight, he said finally without looking away from the window beside him. Eleanor stared at him for a moment before answering carefully. I did not intend to. Intentions rarely matter in rooms like that. His voice remained calm, flat, controlled. Perception does. Eleanor lowered her gaze briefly toward the silver clasp of her gloves. Then perhaps the room should learn to perceive servants as human beings. Lucian looked at her then. Fully this time. The weight of his attention unsettled her pulse again. You speak very confidently for someone with little power. Maybe because people with little power notice cruelty faster. Silence followed. Snow rattled softly against the carriage walls. Lucian leaned back slightly against the dark leather seat studying her with unreadable eyes. You think I was cruel tonight? Eleanor hesitated too long. That alone answered him. One corner of his mouth moved faintly without humor. Interesting. I did not say that. You did not need to. His gaze shifted away again. Most people in that ballroom would have praised me for showing restraint. Eleanor looked down at her hands. Most people in that ballroom seemed frightened of you. They should be. The answer came instantly. Quiet. Certain. Something in the way he said it sent a cold ripple through her chest. Not because he sounded threatening. Because he sounded tired. Like fear had become easier than disappointment. The carriage slowed as Ravenshire Manor appeared through the snow-covered darkness ahead. Tall black towers rose against the night sky beneath hundreds of glowing windows. Eleanor suddenly realized she did not want to go inside. Not because she feared the manor itself. Because she feared how quickly the place was beginning to matter to her. Servants hurried toward the carriage the moment it stopped. Lucian stepped down first before offering Eleanor his hand automatically. She stared at it for one surprised heartbeat before accepting. His fingers closed around hers briefly. Warm despite the cold night air. Steady. The contact lasted barely seconds before he released her again. Yet somehow it lingered afterward. Lord Ravenshire. A sharply familiar voice cut through the snowfall before Eleanor could move toward the entrance. Beatrice Hollowmere descended the front steps wrapped in a fur-lined ivory cloak with clear fury restrained behind her perfect expression. I was told you already returned. Lucian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Apparently. Beatrice's pale eyes flicked toward Eleanor standing beside him. The anger sharpened immediately. I wish to speak with you privately. Then tomorrow would be more appropriate. No, Beatrice replied softly. I think tonight is necessary. Snow drifted silently around them while footmen pretended not to listen. Eleanor stepped back instinctively. I should go inside. Stay. Lucian's voice came low and immediate. Both women looked at him in surprise. He seemed to realize the mistake instantly. A hard line appeared briefly between his brows before he exhaled once. "It is late," he corrected calmly. "There is no need for dramatics tonight." Beatrice stared at him for a long moment beneath the falling snow. Then finally she smiled. "Beautiful, controlled, dangerous. Of course," she said softly. "I would hate to create discomfort." Eleanor felt the warning hidden beneath the words immediately. So did Lucian. "Good night, Miss Hollowmere," he said flatly. Beatrice inclined her head once before disappearing back inside the manor without another glance at Eleanor. Silence settled again. One of the footmen shifted awkwardly nearby. Lucian finally looked toward Eleanor. "Do not provoke her again." Eleanor blinked softly. "I did not realize kindness qualified as provocation." Something unreadable crossed his expression, then vanished. "In families like mine," he said quietly, "kindness is usually mistaken for weakness." Before Eleanor could answer, he turned and disappeared into the manor shadows, leaving her standing alone beneath the snow. The West Wing corridors remained dimly lit when Eleanor finally reached them nearly 20 minutes later. Most servants had already retired for the night. Firelight flickered weakly across the dark walls while wind moved softly beyond the windows. She loosened her gloves slowly as exhaustion settled heavily into her bones. The banquet had drained her more than she wanted to admit. Every conversation, every stare, every carefully hidden insult. She was halfway down the corridor when voices stopped her cold. "You are becoming careless." The voice belonged to Martha. Calm, low, controlled. Eleanor froze beside the corner instinctively before the servants' hall entrance. Another voice answered quietly. Male. Nervous. "I did not mean to upset his lordship." The young servant from the ballroom. "Meaning to and doing so are rarely connected," Martha replied. "You should remember that." Eleanor carefully glanced toward the partially open doorway. Martha stood near the long servant tables beneath warm candlelight while the young footman stared downward in visible shame. "I am sorry," he whispered again. "Miss Hollowmere said I embarrassed the household." Martha's face remained unreadable. Miss Hollowmere concerns herself deeply with appearances. Was she angry? No, Martha folded a linen napkin with precise fingers. People like her rarely waste anger on servants. That would require seeing them first. The boy swallowed hard. Then why did Lord Ravenshire stop her? Martha looked toward the candle flame beside her. Because his father once dismissed a stable boy after a similar mistake. What happened? For the first time since Eleanor had known her, Martha hesitated. Barely a second. Still noticeable. The boy froze to death 3 days later during a storm after failing to find work elsewhere. Silence swallowed the room. The young servant looked horrified. My God! Martha's gaze lowered slowly. Lord Ravenshire was 16 when it happened. Eleanor felt something tighten painfully in her chest. Suddenly Lucian's exhaustion made more sense. So did the coldness. So did the strange restraint beneath every interaction. He never forgot it, Martha continued quietly. Some men are shaped by power. Others are haunted by it. Eleanor remained frozen in the hallway listening despite herself. Martha picked up another folded napkin slowly. Go get some sleep, she told the servant gently now. And next time, carry fewer glasses. The boy laughed weakly with relief before hurrying away. Martha remained alone after he left. Still, silent, thoughtful. Eleanor should have walked away then. Instead, she stepped into the doorway softly. Martha looked up immediately, not startled, almost like she already knew Eleanor had been listening. You heard enough to satisfy your curiosity? The older woman asked calmly. Eleanor flushed slightly. I was not trying to eavesdrop. Everyone eavesdrops in large houses. Martha set the linens aside. That is how people survive them. Eleanor hesitated before speaking carefully. You know him well. Something unreadable flickered behind Martha's eyes. Better than most. Eleanor stepped farther into the warm servants' hall. Firelight softened the sharp shadows across the older woman's face. You speak about him differently than everyone else does. How so? Like he is a person instead of a title. Martha's gaze held hers steadily. Titles are the least interesting thing about people. Silence stretched quietly between them. Then Martha spoke again. Why did you defend the servant tonight? Eleanor looked down briefly at the rough wooden table beside her fingertips. Because no one defended me when I was younger. Martha watched her carefully now. Sharply. What happened? Eleanor almost answered automatically, then stopped herself. Some memories still felt too heavy to place into words. Nothing dramatic, she said softly. Just years of learning how quickly people enjoy humiliating quiet girls. Martha remained silent. Eleanor laughed faintly without humor. My mother used to say invisible women were safer. Was she right? Eleanor thought about that for a long moment. No, she whispered finally. Invisible women are simply easier to hurt. Something changed in Martha's face then, deep enough that Eleanor noticed immediately. Regret, perhaps, or recognition. The older woman turned away toward the fire before Eleanor could study her expression further. You should sleep, Martha said quietly. Tomorrow will not be easier. Eleanor frowned slightly. Why? Martha looked back at her over one shoulder. Candlelight caught the silver strands in her dark hair. Because tonight, she said softly, Lord Ravenshire started paying attention to you. The next morning arrived wrapped in thick gray fog that swallowed the Ravenshire grounds so completely the manor appeared to float above clouds. Eleanor stood beside the breakfast room window watching servants cross the courtyard with lanterns glowing faintly through the mist while distant church bells echoed somewhere beyond the hills. The house felt quieter than usual, tighter somehow, like everyone inside it sensed an approaching storm even though the snow had stopped during the night. Behind her, silverware touched china with soft measured sounds. Beatrice Hollowmere sat at the far end of the long breakfast table dressed in pale cream silk with emerald earrings glittering beneath the chandelier light. Perfect again. Untouched by yesterday's humiliation. She stirred sugar into her tea without looking up. I hear the staff spent all evening discussing you, she said lightly. Eleanor lowered her gaze from the window. How unfortunate for them. On the contrary, Beatrice smiled faintly. You have become very entertaining. Mrs. Weatherby entered before Eleanor could answer. Lord Ravenshire will not join breakfast. Beatrice's expression tightened almost invisibly. Again. His lordship is occupied. The housekeeper turned toward Eleanor instead. Miss Whitgrave, there has been a small issue regarding the West inventory ledgers. Eleanor blinked softly. I am sorry? One of the upstairs maids claims a family heirloom bracelet disappeared shortly after you arrived yesterday. Silence settled instantly across the breakfast room. Eleanor stared at Mrs. Weatherby for one disbelieving heartbeat. Then at Beatrice. The other woman did not look surprised enough. I see, Eleanor said quietly. Mrs. Weatherby folded her hands calmly. The matter is likely a misunderstanding. Of course it is, Beatrice added with smooth sympathy. No one is accusing you directly. Eleanor almost laughed at that. Almost. That is generous. Mrs. Weatherby's expression remained unreadable. The maid insists she left the bracelet near the west corridor dressing tables shortly before dinner. Eleanor understood immediately. The corridor outside her temporary room. And it vanished after I passed through. Apparently. Eleanor looked toward the untouched tea cooling beside her plate. Humiliation arrived differently now. Less like panic. More like exhaustion settling slowly into her bones. What would you like me to do? She asked calmly. Beatrice tilted her head slightly. Surely you understand why the staff might feel nervous. Eleanor met her gaze directly. About what? Well, Beatrice hesitated delicately. You are not accustomed to households like this. There it was. Not an accusation. Worse, a suggestion. The implication hanging politely in the air that poor women naturally tempted suspicion. Eleanor folded her napkin carefully onto the table. Then perhaps the household should lock away its silver whenever guests arrive from outside London. Beatrice's smile vanished briefly. Mrs. Weatherby cleared her throat. No one is suggesting theft. No, Eleanor replied softly. Only class. The breakfast room fell silent again. Then, unexpectedly, another voice entered behind them. And class has always made excellent camouflage for cruelty. Eleanor turned sharply. Martha stood in the doorway carrying fresh linens over one arm. The older woman's expression remained perfectly calm as she stepped farther into the room. Mrs. Weatherby stiffened immediately. This conversation does not concern the staff. Most interesting conversations eventually do. Martha crossed toward the sideboard with composed elegance completely inappropriate for a servant. Again Eleanor noticed it, the impossible refinement in every movement. Beatrice noticed too this time. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You seem unusually bold for a maid. Martha adjusted the linens without looking at her. And you seem unusually interested in humiliating strangers before breakfast. Eleanor nearly choked on her tea. Mrs. Weatherby looked horrified. Beatrice went completely still. Excuse me? Martha finally raised her eyes calmly. If Miss Whitgrave stole the bracelet, then search her room. If she did not, perhaps we should stop treating poverty like evidence. The silence afterward felt almost dangerous. Eleanor stared openly now. No ordinary servant would speak that way to a future countess candidate. No ordinary servant would survive it. Yet Martha stood completely untroubled beneath Beatrice's icy stare. You forget your place, Beatrice said coldly. No, Martha replied quietly. I remember yours. Something flickered sharply across Mrs. Weatherby's face. Fear. Real fear. Before Beatrice could answer, footsteps sounded outside the breakfast room. Lucian entered, still wearing black riding gloves dusted faintly with frost. The tension in the room shifted instantly. His gray eyes moved once across their expressions. Measuring. Assessing. What happened? Nobody answered immediately. Finally Beatrice spoke with careful control. A bracelet disappeared. Lucian looked toward Eleanor first. Not Beatrice. Not Mrs. Weatherby. Eleanor felt the quiet weight of his attention settle against her skin. And? He asked flatly. Mrs. Weatherby stepped forward cautiously. One of the maids believed the item may have been misplaced near Miss Whitgrave's room. Lucian removed one glove slowly. Do you believe Miss Whitgrave stole it? The question landed like a blade across the table. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated too long. No, my lord. Of course not. Good. He placed the gloves beside his untouched plate. Then stop insulting my guests with gossip. Beatrice stared at him in disbelief. You cannot simply dismiss this. I just did. His tone never rose. It did not need to. The room obeyed anyway. Eleanor watched him carefully while servants hurried nervously around the edges of the breakfast room, pretending not to hear any of it. Lucian turned toward Martha next. Their eyes met briefly. Something silent passed between them too quickly for Eleanor to understand. Recognition, perhaps. Or warning. Then his attention shifted back toward Eleanor. Walk with me. The request startled everyone at the table, including her. Beatrice recovered first. Lord Ravenshire, the estate accountant arrives in 20 minutes. Then he can wait. Lucian looked at Eleanor once more. Unless Miss Whitgrave objects. She should have objected. Instead she rose quietly from the table. No, they crossed the west gardens together beneath a sky the color of cold iron while fog drifted low across the snow-covered hedges. Lucian walked with his hands clasped behind his back and his dark coat moving sharply in the winter wind. Eleanor matched his pace carefully along the frozen stone path. For several minutes neither spoke. You handled breakfast well, he said finally. Eleanor let out a quiet breath that almost became laughter. That is an extremely generous interpretation. You did not cry. She looked toward the frost-covered rose garden beside them. Was I expected to? Most people become emotional when publicly accused. Eleanor smiled faintly without humor. Most people spend their lives believing accusations against them matter. Lucian slowed slightly beside the frozen fountain at the center of the garden. And you do not? Eleanor hesitated. When I was 17, my aunt accused me of stealing money from her writing desk. His gaze sharpened immediately. Did you? No, she wrapped her gloves tighter against the cold. But everyone believed her anyway because poor relatives are convenient suspects. Lucian watched her carefully now. What happened? Eleanor looked out across the snow. Nothing dramatic. They searched my room. Found nothing. Then pretended the accusation never happened. Her mouth curved faintly again. That was almost worse. Silence followed. Wind moved softly through the dead rose branches around them. Finally Lucian spoke. You stayed with them afterward. I had nowhere else to go. Something dark flickered through his expression. Not pity. Anger perhaps. Not at her. People can become very cruel when they believe dependence makes someone powerless, he said quietly. Eleanor looked at him then. Really looked. The exhaustion remained there beneath his composure. But so did something else now. Recognition. Before she could answer, hurried footsteps broke the silence. A young maid approached breathlessly through the fog holding something silver in trembling hands. My lord, Miss Hollowmere. She stopped abruptly after realizing Beatrice was not there. The bracelet was found. Lucian's expression cooled instantly. Where? Inside Miss Hollowmere's jewelry case, sir. Silence swallowed the garden whole. Eleanor stared at the maid in disbelief. I thought she said it disappeared. The servant swallowed hard. Apparently it was packed accidentally before the banquet. Lucian looked away toward the frozen fountain for one long moment. Then he laughed once under his breath. Bitter, quiet, tired. Of course it was. The maid hurried back toward the manor, leaving them alone again among the snow-covered gardens. Eleanor stood completely still beside him. She knew, she whispered finally. Lucian did not deny it. Yes. And you still invited her here. His jaw tightened slightly. Families like mine are built on alliances, Miss Whitgrave. Not honesty. Eleanor felt something ache unexpectedly in her chest then. Not for herself. For him. Because for the first time since arriving at Ravenshire Manor, she realized Lucian Ravenshire did not look like a man searching for love. He looked like a man trying to survive disappointment before it reached him first. By evening the fog had thickened again, wrapping Ravenshire Manor in a cold silver haze that blurred the towers into shadows against the darkening sky. Inside, fireplaces burned low throughout the west wing, while servants moved quietly through corridors carrying candles and fresh coal. The entire estate seemed suspended in a strange, uneasy stillness after the bracelet incident. Nobody mentioned it openly. That somehow made it worse. Eleanor sat alone in the library near one of the tall, arched windows with an untouched book resting open across her lap. Rain tapped softly against the glass now, melting the last of the snow gathered along the stone ledges outside. She had been trying to read for nearly 20 minutes and had not absorbed a single sentence. Her thoughts kept circling back to Lucian, to the look on his face in the frozen garden. Not anger, not embarrassment, weariness, the kind carried by people who had learned disappointment long before adulthood. You are holding the book upside down. Eleanor startled softly and looked up. Martha stood near the library entrance carrying a silver candle tray, her expression perfectly composed despite the amusement flickering faintly beneath it. Eleanor glanced downward in horror. The book was indeed upside down. Heat rushed immediately into her cheeks. That is unfortunate. Martha crossed the room slowly. Distracting thoughts? Eleanor closed the book carefully. Something like that. Martha set the candles onto a side table beside the fireplace. Warm gold light flickered across the older woman's face, softening the severe lines there just enough to reveal exhaustion Eleanor had not noticed before. You are thinking about him too much already, Martha observed quietly. Eleanor blinked. I did not realize my thoughts were visible. To people paying attention, everything is visible. The answer came too quickly, too personally. Eleanor studied her again. More and more, Martha felt less like a servant and more like someone wearing the shape of one. Why are you really here? The question escaped before Eleanor could stop it. Silence filled the library. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the hills. Martha looked toward the fire instead of answering immediately. That is a dangerous question in this family. Eleanor lowered the book into her lap fully now. You never behave like the other servants. Perhaps the other servants are smarter. No, Eleanor shook her head gently. They are afraid. You are not. Martha's gray eyes shifted toward her slowly, sharp enough to cut through silence itself. Fear becomes exhausting after enough years. Before Eleanor could answer, the library doors opened abruptly. Lucian entered, still wearing his dark riding coat with rainwater glistening faintly along one shoulder. He stopped immediately after noticing them both beside the fire. Something unreadable crossed his expression. I did not realize the library was occupied. Martha reached for the candle tray again smoothly. I was just leaving. Lucian's gaze lingered on her one heartbeat too long. Again Eleanor caught it. That strange silent awareness between them. Familiarity hidden beneath careful restraint. Martha inclined her head once before moving past him toward the door. Just before leaving, she paused beside Eleanor briefly. Do not stay awake too late, she said quietly. Storms make this house remember things. Then she disappeared into the corridor shadows. Silence settled behind her. Lucian removed his gloves slowly beside the door. You spend a great deal of time with the staff. Eleanor looked toward the rain streaking down the windows. They are easier to speak with than most aristocrats. That is because servants survive by listening. He crossed toward the fireplace while loosening the collar of his coat. Aristocrats survive by pretending. Eleanor almost smiled. You say that like you dislike your own class. I dislike dishonesty. He stopped beside the fire, warmth flickering across the sharp lines of his face. Unfortunately, they are usually the same thing. Eleanor watched him quietly now. Without the formal atmosphere of banquet halls and dining rooms around him, Lucian seemed different somehow. Less controlled. More tired. The storm outside deepened, thunder rolling closer while rain battered the tall windows harder. You should not have defended me this morning, she said softly after a moment. His eyes lifted toward hers immediately. Why not? Because it created unnecessary tension with Miss Hollowmere. Miss Hollowmere creates tension naturally. The answer came flat and immediate. Eleanor hesitated. You already knew she lied about the bracelet before it was found. Lucian stared into the fire. Yes. Then why say nothing? Something dark moved briefly through his expression. Because exposing people rarely changes them. The rain hammered harder against the windows now. Wind moved low through the ancient walls. Eleanor wrapped her fingers tighter around the closed book resting in her lap. You sound disappointed all the time, she said quietly. Lucian looked at her sharply. That is an unusually direct observation. It is also true. Silence followed. Long enough for the firewood to crack softly between them. Finally he spoke again. When I was 23, I was engaged. Eleanor blinked softly, surprised by the sudden confession. Lucian's gaze remained fixed on the flames. Her name was Evelyn Mercer. Beautiful, intelligent, perfect according to every family in London. His mouth curved faintly without warmth. My mother adored her. Eleanor listened without interrupting. 3 weeks before the wedding, he continued quietly, I discovered she had been secretly negotiating with my uncle to gain control of part of the Ravenshire shipping contracts after the marriage. Eleanor felt her chest tighten slightly. I am sorry. Lucian shook his head once. Do not be. She was only doing what society trained her to do. Which was treat marriage like business. The storm outside cracked sharply with thunder. Candle flames flickered violently across the library walls. Eleanor studied his face carefully now beneath the shifting firelight. That is why you invited women here, she realized softly. To test them. Lucian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I invited suitable candidates. No, Eleanor shook her head gently. You invited women you expected to disappoint you. Silence crashed down harder than the thunder outside. Lucien looked at her then with an intensity that made her pulse stumble painfully against her ribs. Not angry, not cold, exposed. You believe you understand me already? He asked quietly. Eleanor immediately regretted speaking. I did not mean. Most people spend years misunderstanding me. He stepped closer toward the firelight, gray eyes darker now beneath the storm shadows. You have been here less than a week. Eleanor stood slowly from the chair. Then perhaps I should stop trying. The air between them shifted, tightened. Rain lashed the windows harder while thunder rolled directly overhead. Lucien looked suddenly exhausted again. More than before. I am not angry with you, he said finally. Then why do you sound like you are preparing for disappointment? His expression changed slightly at that. Barely visible, but real. Eleanor realized then how dangerous this conversation had become. Not because he frightened her. Because he did not. She should have been intimidated by Lucien Ravenshire. Every other woman seemed to be. Instead she felt something far worse. She understood him. And understanding lonely people always carried risk. A sudden crash echoed somewhere deep in the manor. Eleanor startled instinctively. Voices rose faintly from the corridor outside, followed by hurried footsteps. The library doors flew open moments later. Mrs. Weatherby appeared pale beneath the candlelight. My lord! Lucien turned instantly alert. What happened? The east wing roof is leaking again after the storm. The housekeeper swallowed tightly. Part of Lady Ravenshire's private suite flooded. Silence hit the room immediately. Eleanor saw the shift in Lucien's face before he spoke. Not irritation. Something colder. Older. Seal the corridor, he ordered flatly. No servants enter her rooms without my permission. Mrs. Weatherby nodded quickly before disappearing again. Lucien remained completely still beside the fire afterward. Eleanor watched him carefully. Your mother is not returning soon, is she? She asked softly. His eyes closed briefly. Just 1 second. Enough to reveal exhaustion too deep to hide anymore. No, he said quietly. My mother has not been home in almost 3 years. The thunder outside rolled again across Ravenshire Manor while firelight flickered across his face. And for the first time since arriving at the estate, Eleanor realized something even more unsettling than the secrets hidden inside the house. Everyone at Ravenshire Manor still behaved as though Lady Ravenshire might walk through the doors tomorrow, including Lucien himself. The storm worsened after midnight. Wind slammed against Ravenshire Manor hard enough to rattle the ancient windows while rain poured across the stone roofs in relentless sheets of silver. Eleanor lay awake listening to the house groan beneath the weather, unable to stop thinking about Lucien standing motionless beside the fire earlier that evening. My mother has not been home in almost 3 years. The words had settled somewhere deep inside her chest and refused to leave. Most families would call that abandonment. Ravenshire Manor treated it like weather. Unpleasant. Temporary. Never spoken aloud. Another violent crack of thunder shook the west wing. Eleanor sat upright immediately when voices suddenly echoed through the corridor outside her room. Urgent footsteps followed. Then shouting somewhere distant below. She pushed aside the blankets quickly and crossed toward the door just as another sound split through the manor. Glass shattering. What happened? A servant cried somewhere downstairs. Eleanor opened the door into chaos. Servants rushed through the corridor carrying buckets and lanterns while water dripped steadily from the ceiling beams above. Rain had begun leaking through parts of the upper roofline. Mrs. Weatherby stood near the staircase directing staff with sharp, clipped instructions while thunder rolled overhead again. Move the linens first. Seal the east gallery immediately. Do not let the water reach the portrait hall. Eleanor stepped into the corridor instinctively. Can I help? Mrs. Weatherby barely glanced at her. No, then another servant hurried around the corner breathless and pale. The old west chimney collapsed partway into the storage rooms. The housekeeper went still. Anyone hurt? No, ma'am. But the lower corridor flooded. Water already spread across parts of the floor near the staircase. Eleanor gathered the hem of her nightdress slightly and moved closer. "You need more hands." Mrs. Weatherby's expression hardened instantly. "Guests do not assist with disasters in this household." "Then your household is making a mistake." Before the older woman could answer, another voice entered behind them. "She is right." Lucian climbed the staircase 2 steps at a time, still wearing dark trousers and a half-buttoned white shirt beneath a soaked black coat. Rainwater dripped from his hair onto the marble floor. He looked exhausted, furious, completely awake. Every servant in the corridor straightened immediately. "The north servants' hall flooded," he said flatly. "Move everyone from the lower west rooms before the ceiling weakens further." His eyes landed briefly on Eleanor standing barefoot in the corridor. Something unreadable flickered there. "You should be in your room. And you should be asleep," she answered softly before she could stop herself. A servant nearby nearly dropped an entire stack of towels. Lucian stared at her 1 second too long. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved faintly. "Apparently neither of us is very obedient." Thunder cracked again above them. Water dripped steadily now through part of the ceiling near the portrait gallery entrance. Mrs. Weatherby turned sharply toward Eleanor. "Fine. If you insist on helping, take blankets to the lower servants' wing." "I can handle the east corridor," another maid offered nervously. "No," Mrs. Weatherby's face tightened visibly. "Nobody enters Lady Ravenshire's suite." The words hung heavily in the air. Lucian's jaw hardened almost immediately. Eleanor noticed. So did everyone else. Martha appeared from the stairwell below carrying folded linens against one arm. Completely dry despite the storm. Completely composed despite the chaos. "The leak near the east wing worsened," she said calmly. "Water is already reaching the outer sitting room." Lucian looked toward her sharply. "I told them to seal the corridor. And they did." Martha's gray eyes held his steadily. "The roof does not care." Silence flickered briefly between them again. That strange silent familiarity Eleanor still could not explain. Then Lucian exhaled once. Tired. Defeated almost. "Fine. Move the furniture before the ceilings collapse." Martha nodded once before disappearing back downstairs without another word. Eleanor watched Lucian carefully. "You still preserve her rooms exactly as she left them." His expression cooled instantly. "This is not the time." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "I think it might be." Something dark moved behind his eyes then. Not anger exactly. Pain sharpened into restraint. Before he could answer, another servant stumbled into the corridor soaked from head to toe. The library windows burst open from the wind. Lucian cursed softly beneath his breath and moved immediately toward the staircase. Eleanor followed without thinking. "Miss Whitgrave," Mrs. Weatherby snapped sharply. "Guests are not expected to risk themselves for furniture." Eleanor paused only briefly. "Then it is fortunate I was never treated like a guest here." Then she followed Lucian downstairs into the storm-darkened halls. The library looked like something out of a shipwreck. Rain blew violently through shattered windows while curtains snapped wildly in the wind and water spread across the polished floors beneath overturned chairs. Servants struggled to secure heavy drapes while lightning flashed beyond the glass. Lucian crossed directly toward the broken windows with terrifying focus. Board them from the outside before the entire west wall floods. Eleanor immediately moved toward the soaked books scattered across the floor near the fireplace. "These need moving before the water ruins them." "Leave them," one servant shouted over the storm. "There are too many." Eleanor ignored him and lifted another armful anyway. Leather bindings slipped damply against her fingers while freezing rain sprayed through the broken windows. Across the room, Lucian shoved one of the heavy shutters closed against the violent wind with visible strain. Another servant lost his grip on a ladder nearby and nearly slipped against the flooded marble floor. Lucian caught the side before it collapsed. "Watch yourself," he snapped. Thunder exploded overhead hard enough to shake the room. Then suddenly every candle in the library died at once. Darkness swallowed the manor completely. Someone screamed softly near the doorway. Wind roared through the broken windows while rain hammered against stone. Eleanor froze beside the fireplace, clutching soaked books against her chest as lightning flashed white across the room for half a second. Long enough to illuminate Lucian standing near the shattered windows like a figure carved from storm clouds themselves. Then darkness returned again. "Lanterns!" Lucian ordered sharply somewhere through the dark. "Now!" Footsteps scrambled immediately. Eleanor carefully stepped forward through the flooded floor, searching blindly for the nearest table when her foot suddenly slipped against wet marble. The stack of books crashed from her arms as she lost balance completely. Before she hit the ground, strong hands caught her hard around the waist. Eleanor gasped softly in shock. Lucian steadied her instantly against him while thunder rolled violently overhead again. For one impossible second, neither of them moved. Rain lashed through the shattered windows around them. Darkness pressed close on every side except for brief flashes of lightning illuminating his face inches from hers. Eleanor became painfully aware of everything at once. His hand gripping her waist, the cold rainwater dripping from his hair, the sharp, unsteady rhythm of her own breathing. Lucian looked down at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not cold, not guarded, something rawer, more dangerous. "Careful," he said quietly. His voice sounded different now, lower somehow. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I am trying." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room. Then suddenly smoke curled sharply from the far side of the library near the curtains beside the fireplace. One overturned lantern had rolled against the heavy velvet fabric during the blackout. Fire climbed upward instantly. "Fire!" a servant shouted in panic. Everything changed at once. Lucian released Eleanor immediately and crossed the room toward the burning curtains while servants scrambled for water buckets. Flames spread fast across the dry velvet despite the storm rain blowing through the shattered windows. Eleanor grabbed the nearest water basin without thinking and rushed forward through the chaos. "Move back!" Lucian ordered sharply as sparks climbed toward the ceiling beams. Nobody listened. Too much confusion. Too much smoke. One terrified young maid froze directly beside the spreading fire, unable to move at all. Eleanor reached her first. "Come on." The girl shook violently. "I cannot." "Yes, you can." Eleanor grabbed both her hands firmly. "Look at me. Not the fire. Me." Another servant dumped water across part of the curtains while Lucian tore the burning fabric down from the wall himself. Smoke filled the library, thick and choking now. The young maid still could not move. Eleanor pulled her backward hard enough to break the frozen panic gripping her, while another section of flaming fabric collapsed directly where the girl had been standing seconds earlier. The maid burst into tears instantly. Eleanor wrapped one arm around her shoulders. "You are all right." Across the smoke-filled room, Lucian looked up sharply after hearing her voice. Their eyes met through the chaos. Then Martha suddenly appeared beside him carrying another water bucket without hesitation. Together they extinguished the remaining flames before the fire could spread farther into the west wall. Silence slowly settled afterward except for rain striking broken glass and the heavy sound of everyone breathing too hard. Smoke drifted weakly through the ruined library beneath flashes of distant lightning. Eleanor remained kneeling beside the frightened maid near the fireplace, gently smoothing trembling hands while whispering calm reassurances. "It is over now. You are safe. Breathe slowly." The girl clung to her sleeve like a child. Across the room, Lucian stood completely still, watching them through smoke and rainwater. His white shirt clung damply against his shoulders. Ash darkened one sleeve near his wrist. Yet he barely seemed aware of any of it. Because for the first time since Eleanor Whitgrave arrived at Ravenshire Manor, Lucian Ravenshire looked at her the way starving men looked at warmth. By dawn the storm had finally broken. Ravenshire Manor stood wrapped in pale gray silence beneath a sky washed clean by rain while exhausted servants moved through the damaged halls carrying broken furniture, ruined curtains, and waterlogged rugs toward the lower courtyards. Smoke still lingered faintly in parts of the west wing. The library remained sealed behind heavy oak doors, while workers repaired shattered windows and scorched walls. Eleanor had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lucian standing across the smoke-filled room looking at her with something dangerously close to need. It unsettled her more than the fire itself. She stood near the east corridor windows, watching servants clear debris from the gardens below when quiet footsteps approached behind her. "You should be resting." Martha's voice came low and calm as always. Eleanor turned slowly. The older woman carried a fresh tray of tea and bandages balanced carefully against one arm. "I could say the same thing to you." Martha glanced toward the dark circles beneath Eleanor's eyes. "Unlike you, I am very practiced at exhaustion." Eleanor accepted the tea gratefully. Warmth spread slowly through her cold fingers. "How bad was the damage?" "Manageable." Martha looked toward the distant west wing. "The library survived. Lord Ravenshire nearly destroyed 3 servants trying to save it anyway." Eleanor frowned slightly. "Is he hurt?" The question escaped too quickly. Martha noticed immediately. Of course she did. "A burned hand," she answered quietly. "Nothing serious." Relief moved through Eleanor so fast it embarrassed her. Martha watched the expression cross her face with sharp, silent understanding. "That is dangerous," the older woman murmured. Eleanor looked away toward the windows. "Concern is not the same thing." "No," Martha's tone remained calm. "But lonely people often mistake kindness for salvation." Silence followed. Eleanor traced one fingertip slowly around the edge of the teacup. "You speak as though you have seen it happen before." Martha's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Older somehow. Sadder. "I have." Before Eleanor could ask more, footsteps sounded from farther down the corridor. Lucian appeared moments later wearing a dark waistcoat beneath an unbuttoned coat, while a servant attempted unsuccessfully to wrap fresh linen around his injured hand. "It is fine," he said flatly. "You are making it worse." The servant looked miserable. "My lord," the physician specifically instructed. The physician also attempted to prescribe brandy for smoke inhalation. "I am beginning to question his qualifications." Eleanor nearly smiled despite herself. Lucian noticed immediately. His gaze lingered on her mouth for one dangerous second before shifting away again. Martha stepped smoothly toward the servant. "Give me the bandages." The young man obeyed instantly without question. Again Eleanor noticed it, the authority hidden beneath Martha's quiet voice. Lucian held out his injured hand automatically toward her. Automatic familiarity. Eleanor caught that too. Martha began rewrapping the burn carefully while Lucian stood completely still beside her. Not once did he flinch. "You should rest today," Martha said quietly while securing the linen. "You have not slept." "Neither have you." "I was not nearly crushed beneath a falling ceiling." Eleanor looked up sharply. Lucian's expression remained neutral. One of the support beams collapsed during the fire. Martha tied the final knot firmly. "He failed to mention that part." Eleanor felt cold settle instantly through her chest. "You could have been seriously injured." Lucian finally looked toward her directly. "But I was not." "That does not make it less reckless." Something unreadable flickered behind his eyes then. "Interesting." "What is?" "You sound angry." Eleanor folded her arms lightly against the cold draft moving through the damaged corridor. "Someone should be." Silence settled between them, heavy, aware. Martha stepped back slowly after finishing the bandages. Her gray eyes moved once between them both before she gathered the tray again. "The east sitting room still leaks," she said calmly. "Someone should inspect it before the rain returns tonight." Lucian nodded distractedly without looking away from Eleanor. "I will handle it later." Martha's gaze sharpened slightly. "No, you will not." The words landed with quiet authority. Lucian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor stared openly now. No servant spoke to him that way, yet he accepted it without argument. "Fine," he said finally. "Tomorrow." Martha seemed satisfied with that answer. She turned toward Eleanor next. "Walk with me." Eleanor blinked softly. "Now?" "Unless you have suddenly become very busy." Lucian watched them both carefully while Martha disappeared farther down the corridor without waiting for agreement. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before following. They crossed into the older east wing where silence pressed heavier against the manor walls. Fewer servants moved here. Dust gathered thicker across tables and portraits. Many of the rooms remained closed entirely behind heavy wooden doors untouched for years. "This part of the house feels abandoned," Eleanor murmured quietly. Martha walked ahead, carrying the tea tray steadily through dim light and shadows. Most families preserve grief like furniture. They stopped outside a narrow sitting room near the far end of the corridor. Rainwater still dripped slowly through one damaged ceiling corner into metal buckets placed across the floor. Martha set the tray down carefully near the fireplace before crossing toward the windows. "Help me move this." Together they pulled a small velvet chair away from the leaking section of ceiling, while wind moved softly beyond the cracked glass panes. The room smelled faintly of old perfume and cedarwood. Eleanor glanced slowly around the space. Everything inside remained strangely untouched. Embroidered shawls draped over chairs. Half-finished letters stacked neatly beside an ink bottle. A silver music box resting open atop the mantel. This was her room, Eleanor realized softly. Martha did not answer immediately. Part of it. Eleanor approached the music box carefully. Dust coated the edges except for one recently disturbed section near the lid. Someone still came here. Frequently. "Lucian keeps everything exactly the same," she whispered. Martha stood beside the rain-streaked window looking out across the fog-covered gardens. "People believe preserving objects preserves love. Do you?" A long silence followed. Then finally "And my son paid for it." Silence crashed through Eleanor so hard she forgot to breathe. "My son." The words echoed sharply inside her mind while every strange detail from the past week suddenly rearranged itself all at once. The impossible refinement. The authority servants obeyed instantly. Lucian accepting her commands without question. The untouched East Wing. The silence surrounding Lady Ravenshire. Eleanor felt cold spread slowly through her chest. Martha watched realization dawn across her face with perfect calm. "You already knew," Eleanor whispered. Martha inclined her head once. "From the moment you noticed I did not belong downstairs." Eleanor stepped backward slightly without meaning to. "You are Lady Ravenshire." No, Martha's expression softened for the first time since Eleanor had met her. Not cold now. Not sharp. Just sad. "I am the woman who failed to be her." The words settled heavily into the leaking room while rain dripped steadily into metal buckets nearby. Eleanor stared at her in stunned silence. "Lucian knows you are here pretending to be a maid." "Of course he does." "Then everyone knows." No, Martha crossed slowly toward the fireplace again. "Only Lucian and Mrs. Weatherby." Eleanor struggled to understand. "Why?" Martha picked up the silver music box, carefully turning it once between elegant fingers. "Because after everything that happened, I needed to know whether women still knew how to be kind when nobody important was watching." Eleanor's pulse slowed painfully. "You were testing us." "I was testing everyone." Martha looked directly at her then. "Especially myself." Silence swallowed the room completely. Then footsteps suddenly echoed sharply from the corridor outside. Fast. Angry. Beatrice Hollowmere appeared in the doorway moments later, wrapped in a dark green traveling coat with fury glittering openly across her beautiful face. Her eyes landed first on Eleanor, then on Martha standing beside the fireplace. "There you are." Her voice cut sharply through the room. "I have been looking everywhere for you." Eleanor frowned slightly. "Why?" Beatrice stepped farther inside. "Because Lord Ravenshire just informed me he is canceling tonight's dinner arrangements." Her gaze hardened instantly. "And somehow I suspect you are the reason." The leaking east sitting room fell silent except for the steady sound of rainwater dripping into metal buckets beside the fireplace. Beatrice Hollowmere stood rigid near the doorway, wrapped in deep green wool and visible anger, while Eleanor struggled to steady the storm of realization still crashing through her mind. Martha remained perfectly calm beside the mantel, one elegant hand resting lightly against the silver music box as though nothing important had just happened. "Lady Ravenshire." The woman had been standing beside her all week carrying tea trays and folded linens while quietly watching everything. Beatrice looked between them sharply. "What is this?" she demanded. Eleanor opened her mouth automatically. Nothing came out. Martha answered instead. Miss Whitgrave was helping move furniture before the ceiling collapses. Beatrice narrowed her eyes immediately. How charitable! She stepped farther into the room. Her gaze swept once across the untouched shawls, the old letters, the dustless music box. Confusion flickered briefly across her beautiful face before irritation returned stronger than before. Lord Ravenshire cancelled tonight's dinner because the West Wing remains damaged, she continued coldly. Yet somehow he still found time this morning to walk through the gardens with Miss Whitgrave again. Eleanor looked up sharply. We were discussing the repairs. Of course you were. The smile Beatrice gave her held no warmth whatsoever. How fortunate that disasters continue creating opportunities for intimacy. Martha moved one of the buckets slightly farther from the leaking ceiling with calm, deliberate movements. Jealousy makes intelligent women look very ordinary, Miss Hollowmere. Beatrice turned toward her instantly. You forget yourself again. No, Martha straightened slowly beside the fireplace. I simply dislike cruelty disguised as refinement. The tension in the room sharpened immediately. Eleanor watched Beatrice carefully now. The other woman still had no idea who Martha truly was. Yet something instinctive clearly unsettled her. You seem remarkably invested in Miss Whitgrave, Beatrice said coolly. I admire women who remain kind while being humiliated. Kindness is overrated. Only by people who rarely offer it. Beatrice laughed softly beneath her breath. Interesting. Her pale eyes shifted toward Eleanor again. You do realize everyone in this house is laughing at you now. Eleanor blinked once. I was not aware my humiliation required an audience schedule. Do not pretend innocence. Beatrice crossed closer through the dim leaking room. Lord Ravenshire does not walk through gardens with women he respects. The words landed strangely. Too personal. Too sharp. Eleanor suddenly understood something she had missed before. Beatrice was not angry because Lucian admired Eleanor. She was angry because he usually admired no one. You sound disappointed, Eleanor said quietly. Beatrice's expression hardened instantly. You know nothing about me. No, Eleanor replied softly. But I think you are accustomed to being chosen first. Silence followed. Rain tapped softly against the cracked windows while distant thunder rolled farther across the hills. Beatrice stared at her with open hostility now. Women like you always mistake attention for affection. Eleanor folded her hands carefully in front of her. And women like you often mistake affection for ownership. Martha looked away suddenly toward the fire, hiding what almost looked like amusement. Beatrice noticed. Fury flashed briefly across her face. I am trying very hard not to insult you directly, she said coldly. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. Then you must be exhausted. Before Beatrice could answer, footsteps echoed sharply through the corridor outside. Lucian appeared moments later in the doorway, still wearing his dark coat from the damaged West Wing. The atmosphere changed instantly. His gray eyes moved once across the room, taking in their expressions. Beatrice stepped toward him immediately. Finally, Lucian ignored her completely at first. His attention landed on Eleanor. Mrs. Weatherby said you disappeared. Eleanor felt warmth rise embarrassingly fast into her chest at the quiet concern hidden beneath the words. I was helping here. His gaze shifted briefly toward Martha standing beside the fireplace. Something silent passed between them again. Then he looked back toward Eleanor. You should not remain in this corridor. Parts of the ceiling are unstable. I can decide that myself. One corner of his mouth almost moved. Apparently, Beatrice stared between them both with growing disbelief. Lucian. His attention shifted toward her at last. Immediately colder. What? I would like a moment alone with you. No, the answer came instantly. Flat. Final. Beatrice visibly stiffened. Excuse me? Lucian removed his gloves slowly. I have no interest in another argument today. Then perhaps stop humiliating me publicly. The room went completely still. Eleanor instinctively stepped backward toward the leaking window while Martha remained motionless beside the fire. Lucian's expression darkened faintly. You are not being humiliated. Really? Beatrice laughed softly without humor. The staff barely bother hiding their gossip anymore. Then perhaps stop giving them material. Silence crashed through the room. Beatrice stared at him in open shock. Eleanor suddenly wanted desperately to leave. This no longer felt like irritation. Felt like something unraveling. I have done everything your family expected, Beatrice said quietly now. More dangerous somehow than shouting would have been. Every dinner, every appearance, every conversation. Lucian looked exhausted before she even finished speaking. Beatrice. No, she stepped closer toward him. I am tired of pretending not to notice what is happening. Eleanor's stomach tightened instantly. Lucian's jaw hardened. Nothing is happening. Then look at her. Silence swallowed the room whole. Eleanor stopped breathing entirely. Beatrice's eyes burned now as she pointed directly toward Eleanor standing frozen near the rain-dark windows. Look at her the way you looked at her last night after the fire. Lucian said nothing. That silence answered everything. Beatrice laughed once under her breath. Broken. Angry. There it is. Eleanor immediately turned toward the doorway. I should leave. No, Lucian's voice stopped her instantly. Too fast. Too sharp. Beatrice closed her eyes briefly like the sound physically hurt. Martha remained completely still beside the fireplace, watching all of them with unreadable gray eyes. You cannot even help yourself anymore, Beatrice whispered. Lucian looked toward her finally. This conversation is over. No, she replied quietly. It is finally honest. The rain intensified suddenly against the windows. Wind moved through the cracked hallway outside, carrying cold drafts into the room. Beatrice straightened, slowly pulling dignity around herself like armor. Do you know what your real problem is? She asked softly. Lucian's face became unreadable again. I am certain you intend to tell me. You only notice women after they survive suffering. Silence followed. Heavy and terrible. Eleanor felt the words hit him before he even reacted. Beatrice stepped toward the doorway. Women like me were raised to appear perfect, she continued quietly. Women like her were raised to survive disappointment. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Eleanor. Not kind. Not cruel anymore either. Just painfully honest. That is why men like you eventually choose them. Then she walked out of the room without another word. The silence she left behind felt enormous. Rain dripped steadily into the metal buckets while thunder faded farther into the distance. Lucian remained standing motionless near the doorway, staring after her long after she disappeared. Eleanor looked down at her hands. She was hurt. Yes. And you still let her stay here knowing you could never love her. Lucian's expression hardened instantly. Love has nothing to do with this. Martha finally spoke again from beside the fireplace. That sentence alone explains most of your problems. Lucian looked toward her sharply. Not now. No, Martha replied quietly. Exactly now. The room tightened with tension. Eleanor still did not fully understand. Lucian rubbed one tired hand across his face before turning toward the damaged windows. I am tired. Martha's voice softened slightly for the first time all afternoon. So is everyone else. Eleanor watched them both carefully now. Mother and son. Even standing 3 feet apart, they carried the same exhaustion in their eyes. The same loneliness hidden beneath control. Lucian finally looked toward Eleanor again. Something vulnerable flickered briefly through his expression before restraint buried it once more. I owe you an apology. Eleanor blinked softly. For what? For involving you in this house. The words settled heavily between them. Eleanor stared at him for one long heartbeat. Then another. Finally she spoke very quietly. You did not involve me. His gaze held hers steadily. Did I not? Before Eleanor could answer, another loud crack echoed somewhere above the east corridor ceiling. Dust drifted suddenly from the beams overhead. Martha looked upward instantly. Out! She ordered sharply. This time nobody argued. Lucien crossed directly toward Eleanor, reaching for her arm. At the exact moment another section of ceiling splintered violently above them. The ancient wood groaned once. Then the entire center beam began collapsing straight toward where Eleanor had been standing seconds earlier. Lucien moved before the beam fully broke. Eleanor barely had time to gasp before his hand closed hard around her wrist and pulled her violently backward across the room. Would crash down exactly where she had been standing seconds earlier. The sound exploded through the east sitting room like thunder. Dust and splintered plaster burst through the air, while one of the leaking ceiling lamps shattered against the flooded floor. Eleanor stumbled directly against Lucien's chest as the room shook beneath them. For one terrifying second she could not breathe. His arms locked around her instinctively, shielding her from falling debris, while fragments of plaster scattered across his shoulders and coat. Martha stepped back sharply beside the fireplace as another crack splintered through the weakened ceiling beams overhead. Out! She ordered again, this time with unmistakable authority. Lucien did not hesitate. He kept one arm firmly around Eleanor's waist and guided her through the collapsing room toward the corridor while dust filled the air thick enough to sting her eyes. Behind them, another section of ceiling gave way with a violent groan. Servants shouted somewhere farther down the hallway. The moment they crossed safely into the corridor, Lucien finally released her. Eleanor's knees nearly failed anyway. Are you hurt? His voice came low and immediate. Not cold now. Not restrained. Frightened. Eleanor stared at him, trying to steady her breathing. Dust clung to the dark strands of hair falling across his forehead. One side of his collar had torn during the collapse. No, she whispered. You? He ignored the question completely. Both hands moved automatically to her shoulders, searching for injuries she did not have. Did anything hit you? Lucien. He stopped only after hearing his name spoken that softly. Their eyes locked. Eleanor suddenly became painfully aware of how close they stood in the dim ruined corridor, while rain tapped steadily against distant windows and servants rushed around them carrying lanterns and repair tools. Lucien's hands still rested against her shoulders. Neither of them moved away. My lord! Mrs. Weatherby's voice cut sharply through the moment as she hurried toward them from the far staircase. Her face paled immediately after seeing the collapsed room behind them. Good God! Lucien stepped back at once. The warmth disappeared instantly from his expression. Buried beneath composure so quickly Eleanor almost wondered if she imagined the fear in his eyes moments earlier. Almost. Seal this corridor permanently until the repairs are complete, he ordered flatly. Mrs. Weatherby nodded quickly. Of course. Martha emerged from the damaged room seconds later through drifting dust and broken plaster, carrying the silver music box carefully against her chest. The only object she bothered to save. Eleanor noticed that immediately. So did Lucien. Their eyes met briefly across the corridor. Entire conversations seemed to pass silently between them now. The room is finished, Martha said quietly. Most of the ceiling supports rotted through years ago. Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. You should have told me it worsened this badly. Martha looked tired suddenly. Truly tired. You stopped listening to me a long time ago. Silence followed. Heavy enough to feel physical. Mrs. Weatherby looked away awkwardly while servants pretended not to hear. Lucien's expression closed completely. Everyone out, he said flatly. Now. The corridor emptied almost immediately. Within minutes only Eleanor, Lucien, and Martha remained standing outside the ruined east sitting room, while rainwater dripped softly from damaged beams overhead. Martha looked toward Eleanor first. You should change clothes before you freeze. Eleanor glanced down at her dust-covered skirts. Probably. Martha's gaze softened briefly. You were very lucky. No, Lucien's voice came low beside her. She was standing beneath a collapsing ceiling because I allowed her into unsafe parts of this house. Martha watched him carefully. And now you sound like your father. The words landed hard. Lucien went completely still. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. Something dark and old moved beneath his expression. Do not do that today, he said quietly. Martha held his gaze steadily. Then stop punishing yourself for every disaster around you. Silence spread again. Then, without another word, Martha turned and disappeared down the corridor, carrying the music box against her chest, leaving Eleanor alone beside Lucian in the damaged hallway. Rain continued tapping softly against distant windows. Somewhere downstairs a servant laughed nervously before being shushed immediately. The manor slowly returned to life around them, while tension remained suspended between them both. "You should rest," Lucian said finally. Eleanor studied his face carefully. "You almost got crushed pulling me out of there. That was not your fault." "No," she replied softly. "It was yours." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Excuse me? You protect people like you are trying to atone for something." The words escaped before caution could stop them. Lucian stared at her in silence. Not angry. Wounded, perhaps. "You think you understand me very well." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No. I think you understand suffering very well." Something changed in his expression then. Tiny. Dangerous. Vulnerable. He looked away first. "You should not stay here anymore." Eleanor blinked softly. "What?" Lucian crossed toward the cracked corridor window overlooking the rain-soaked gardens below. "Ravenshire Manor is unstable." "The building or the family?" His mouth curved faintly without humor. "Both." Eleanor folded her hands tightly together, trying to ignore the sudden ache spreading quietly through her chest. "Are you asking me to leave?" Silence followed too long. Finally he answered without turning around. "I am trying to do the responsible thing." Eleanor stared at his back beneath the dim corridor light. Responsible. The word sounded strangely cruel coming from him. "Then why do you look miserable saying it?" He closed his eyes briefly. "Just 1 second. Enough. Because you make this house feel different." The confession hit her harder than any shouted declaration could have. Lucian finally looked back at her then. Exhausted gray eyes. Rain-dark shadows beneath them. Too much loneliness hidden beneath too much control. "And I do not trust different things anymore." Eleanor forgot how to breathe for a moment. The corridor seemed to narrow around them. Suddenly she understood the terrible truth beneath everything since arriving here. Lucian was not cold because he lacked feeling. He was cold because feeling anything terrified him. "You are not asking me to leave because you dislike me," she whispered. "No," the answer came immediately, honest enough to hurt. "Then why?" He stepped closer slowly until only a few feet separated them. "Because every person I have ever needed eventually used it against me." Eleanor's chest tightened painfully. "I am not them. I know." His voice dropped lower now, rougher somehow. "That is the problem." Silence crashed between them. Eleanor could hear the rain, her own heartbeat, the quiet strain beneath every word he spoke. She should walk away now. Any sensible woman would. Instead she remained exactly where she was. "Lucian." He looked at her immediately. That dangerous attention again. Complete. Unavoidable. Eleanor swallowed hard. "I do not know what you think is happening between us." "Neither do I." The honesty in his voice nearly undid her. Another long silence followed. Then footsteps suddenly echoed sharply from the lower staircase. Beatrice Hollowmere appeared moments later dressed in a dark traveling coat with leather gloves clasped tightly in one hand. Her luggage followed behind her, carried by 2 footmen. Eleanor felt the atmosphere shift instantly. Beatrice's eyes moved once between them both, standing alone together outside the ruined room. Understanding settled coldly across her face. "I see," she said quietly. Lucian straightened immediately. Whatever softness had existed moments earlier vanished beneath restraint. "You are leaving." "Yes." Beatrice's smile looked brittle now, beautiful and broken at the same time. "There is very little reason to remain where one is not wanted." Eleanor opened her mouth automatically. "Miss Hollowmere, do not pity me." The words came sharp enough to stop her instantly. Beatrice looked toward Lucian instead. "You know what the truly humiliating part is?" Lucian remained silent. "I think you wanted to love me once." Something flickered behind his expression. Brief, painful, real. Beatrice laughed softly under her breath. But then she arrived. Eleanor felt heat rush into her face immediately. "That is not fair." "No," Beatrice replied quietly. "None of this was." She adjusted her gloves slowly while the footmen waited awkwardly behind her with trunks and coats. "For what it is worth, Miss Whitgrave, I do not actually hate you." Eleanor blinked softly. Beatrice's pale eyes held hers steadily now. Tired instead of cruel. "I hate that he only looks alive when speaking to you." Silence swallowed the corridor whole. Lucien's jaw tightened visibly. Beatrice looked at him one final time. "You should have been honest sooner." Then she turned and walked away down the staircase without looking back again. The sound of her footsteps faded slowly beneath the storm-dark silence of Ravenshire Manor. Eleanor remained motionless beside the ruined east corridor while something painful settled quietly through her chest. Because for the first time since arriving here, someone had finally spoken the truth out loud. And Lucien Ravenshire had never denied it once. That night Ravenshire Manor felt quieter than it had since Eleanor arrived. The storm finally passed, completely leaving the estate wrapped in deep winter stillness beneath clear black skies and pale moonlight reflecting across frozen gardens. Most servants retired early after days of repairs and exhaustion. Even the endless creaking of the old house seemed softer somehow, like the manor itself was holding its breath. Eleanor stood alone beside the narrow window in her room, staring down at the moonlit courtyard below, while Beatrice Hollomere's final words continued echoing relentlessly through her thoughts. "I hate that he only looks alive when speaking to you." She should leave. The realization had followed her all evening. Staying here any longer would only deepen something already becoming dangerous for both of them. Lucien frightened her now in entirely different ways than before. Not because he was cruel. Because he was not. Because every guarded glance and exhausted confession made it harder to protect herself from him. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Eleanor turned immediately. "Come in." Martha entered carrying a folded shawl and a small silver tray with tea balanced carefully beside it. No servant followed her anymore. No pretense remained between them now. Yet somehow that made the older woman feel even more distant, more powerful. Eleanor immediately straightened. "You do not need to bring me tea yourself." Martha closed the door quietly behind her. Old habits. She crossed the room slowly, setting the tray beside the fire. Candlelight flickered warmly across her face, softening the sharpness there into something more human tonight. More tired. "Beatrice left an hour ago," she said quietly. Eleanor nodded once. "I know." Martha studied her carefully. "And now you are thinking about leaving too." Eleanor looked away toward the dark window again. "Would that disappoint you?" Silence followed. Then Martha spoke very softly. "More than I expected." Eleanor felt something tighten painfully in her chest. She crossed slowly toward the fireplace while wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You should not say things like that to me." Martha's gray eyes sharpened faintly. "Why?" "Because this entire house already feels too personal." The older woman watched her in silence for several long seconds. "Do you know why I stayed away so long?" Eleanor looked up. Martha lowered herself slowly into one of the chairs beside the fire. The movement carried a quiet exhaustion Eleanor had never noticed before. "After Lucien's engagement collapsed 3 years ago, we fought constantly." Firelight danced softly across her face while she stared into the flames. "He believed I cared more about appearances than his happiness." Eleanor remained silent. "The terrible part," Martha continued quietly, "was that he was right." Pain moved beneath every word now. Real pain. The kind people carried for years. "I spent most of his childhood teaching him how to survive aristocratic society." One corner of her mouth curved faintly without humor. "I forgot to teach him how to survive loneliness." Eleanor sat slowly across from her beside the fire. "You love him very much." Martha laughed softly under her breath. "Too much, perhaps." The room fell quiet except for crackling firewood and distant winter wind brushing softly against the windows. "When his father died," Martha said after a while, "Lucien was 19 years old, the estate drowning in debt. Half the extended family waiting like vultures to see whether he would fail." Eleanor listened carefully now. He stopped sleeping properly that year. Martha's gaze lowered toward her clasped hands. He learned very quickly that power makes people obedient, but never honest. Eleanor suddenly understood something else then. Something painful. That is why he watches people constantly. Martha looked toward her sharply. Yes. He expects betrayal before kindness. Because betrayal arrives more often. Silence settled heavily again. Eleanor stared into the fire while memories from the past week rearranged themselves quietly in her mind. Lucian standing alone in storm-dark corridors. Lucian preserving empty rooms for a mother who abandoned him. Lucian pulling her away from collapsing ceilings without hesitation. And now? She asked softly. What are you testing anymore? Martha's expression changed slowly, softer than Eleanor had ever seen it. Whether my son still remembers how to hope. The honesty in her voice nearly undid her. Eleanor looked down quickly toward her hands. That is not fair. No, Martha agreed quietly. It is not. Silence stretched between them. Then finally Eleanor whispered the truth she had been avoiding for hours. I think I am beginning to care about him. Martha did not look surprised. I know. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. That frightens me. Good. Eleanor looked up sharply. Martha's gaze held hers steadily across the firelight. Love should frighten intelligent women. That is an awful thing to say. It is an honest thing to say. Martha leaned back slowly against the chair. Especially in families like ours. Eleanor swallowed hard. I do not belong in families like yours. Perhaps not. The older woman's voice softened again. But he belongs with women like you. Tears burned unexpectedly behind Eleanor's eyes. She looked away immediately before Martha could notice. Too late. The older woman noticed everything. You think leaving would protect both of you? Martha said quietly. Eleanor nodded once. Would it not? Martha stared into the fire for a very long time before answering. When I was 22, I loved a man my family considered entirely unsuitable. Eleanor blinked softly. Martha almost smiled at her surprise. Yes, I was once young too. What happened? I married someone more appropriate. The words landed quietly, heavily, and Martha's eyes looked impossibly sad suddenly. And I spent the next 30 years wondering whether loneliness can become hereditary. Silence swallowed the room whole. Eleanor felt her chest ache painfully for the woman sitting across from her. For Lucian. For all the quiet damage hidden inside Ravenshire Manor beneath wealth and marble and titles. A soft knock interrupted them both. Mrs. Weatherby entered carefully. My lady. The title still startled Eleanor every time. Martha looked up calmly. What is it? Lord Ravenshire has not come downstairs all evening. The housekeeper hesitated. One of the servants says he has been in his father's study drinking since dinner. Martha's expression tightened almost invisibly. Eleanor noticed immediately. That is unusual? Mrs. Weatherby answered quietly. His lordship does not usually drink alone. Martha rose slowly from the chair. I will speak with him. No, the word escaped Eleanor before she could stop it. Both women looked at her. Heat rushed into her face instantly. I only mean... She struggled briefly for composure. Perhaps he does not need another argument tonight. Martha watched her very carefully now. Then unexpectedly, one corner of her mouth moved faintly upward. Interesting. Eleanor stood immediately. I should not have said that. No, Martha replied softly. You absolutely should have. Before Eleanor fully understood what was happening, Martha picked up the silver tea tray and moved calmly toward the door. Mrs. Weatherby looked deeply confused. My lady. Martha paused beside the doorway, glancing back once over her shoulder toward Eleanor standing frozen beside the fire. I believe, she said quietly, my son needs someone gentler than me tonight. Then both women disappeared into the corridor, leaving Eleanor completely alone in the sudden silence of the room. For several seconds she remained motionless, staring at the closed door, while her heartbeat slowly turned unsteady beneath her ribs. Then finally she exhaled shakily and reached for her shawl. Lucien's father's study sat at the far end of the north wing beneath towering portraits and dark oak walls untouched by modern renovations. Eleanor hesitated outside the heavy wooden doors after climbing the silent staircase alone. Light flickered faintly beneath the threshold. No voices, no movement, just silence. She almost turned back twice. Then she knocked softly. Nothing happened. Eleanor pushed the door open carefully. The room smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and whiskey. Lucien stood alone beside the massive windows overlooking the frozen grounds below, with one hand resting against the glass and a crystal tumbler hanging loosely from the other. Firelight flickered across the sharp lines of his face while moonlight silvered the dark strands of hair falling carelessly across his forehead. He looked tired enough to break something inside her. "You should not be here," he said quietly without turning around. Eleanor closed the door softly behind her. "Probably not." Silence followed. Lucien finally looked back toward her then. Gray eyes shadowed and exhausted beneath the low firelight. "Did my mother send you?" "No." Eleanor stepped farther into the room slowly. "She simply stopped preventing me." Something almost dangerous flickered briefly across his expression, then vanished again beneath restraint. That was irresponsible of her. Eleanor looked at the untouched whiskey bottle resting beside the desk. "And this is responsible?" Lucien let out a tired breath that almost sounded like laughter. "No." He looked toward the dark windows again. "But it is quieter." Eleanor crossed slowly toward the fire. "You are trying to push me away." "Yes. And it is making you miserable." Silence answered her. The fire crackled softly between them. Finally Lucien spoke without turning around. "You should leave Ravenshire tomorrow." The words hurt more than she expected. Eleanor folded her hands tightly together. "Do you actually want me to?" His jaw tightened visibly. "Too visible." "That is not the point." "Then what is?" He looked at her sharply now. "The point is that women like you do not survive families like mine." Eleanor stared at him across the dim study. "Women like me? Women who still believe kindness matters." His voice roughened slightly beneath the exhaustion. "This house destroys people like that eventually." Eleanor felt something inside her steady suddenly. Quietly, completely. She stepped closer toward him despite every instinct warning her not to. "Then perhaps your house deserves to change." Lucien looked at her like she had just spoken another language. Something fragile moved behind his eyes then. Something terrifyingly close to hope. And that frightened him more than anything else ever had. The next evening Ravenshire Manor blazed with candlelight for the first time since the storm. Hundreds of flames flickered beneath crystal chandeliers while servants moved through polished halls carrying silver trays, fresh flowers, and velvet cloaks in preparation for the annual winter charity reception. Music drifted softly from the ballroom where members of the county aristocracy had already begun arriving beneath the clear frozen skies. Outside, snow covered the grounds in smooth, untouched white. Inside, tension lingered beneath every conversation like smoke hidden beneath perfume. Eleanor stood alone near the grand staircase, adjusting the sleeves of her deep midnight blue gown, while voices and laughter echoed through the marble entrance hall below. She still could not believe she had agreed to attend tonight after everything that happened. After the collapsing ceiling. After Beatrice leaving. After Lucien looking at her in his father's study like she had become something dangerous to him. "You look terrified." Eleanor turned immediately. Martha stood behind her wearing the same simple dark servant dress she had worn all week. Yet somehow tonight the disguise no longer worked. Eleanor could see it clearly now. The elegance in every movement. The quiet authority hidden beneath stillness. "I am terrified," Eleanor admitted softly. Martha adjusted one of the candles lining the staircase railing. "Good." Eleanor laughed faintly under her breath. "You continue giving terrible advice." "No." Martha's gray eyes lifted toward her calmly. "I continue giving honest advice." Music swelled softly from the ballroom below while servants guided arriving guests through the glowing entrance hall. Eleanor glanced toward the crowd nervously. "Does everyone know Lady Ravenshire returned?" No, Martha straightened one silver candlestick carefully. Most of them still believe she remains somewhere in Europe avoiding responsibility. Eleanor hesitated. And tonight? Martha looked toward the ballroom doors. Something unreadable flickered behind her expression. Tonight I stop hiding. The words settled heavily between them. Eleanor studied her carefully. You are nervous too. Martha almost smiled. That is because I am about to humiliate half the aristocracy in this county. Before Eleanor could answer, footsteps echoed through the upper corridor behind them. Lucian appeared moments later descending the staircase from the west wing in formal black evening clothes tailored with brutal precision. Candlelight caught against silver cufflinks and dark velvet beneath his coat while conversations below quieted almost instantly at his appearance. Eleanor forgot how to breathe for one impossible second. He looked devastating tonight, not because of the wealth or title or polished refinement, because for the first time since arriving at Ravenshire Manor, he no longer looked exhausted. He looked focused. His gray eyes found Eleanor immediately across the staircase landing. The entire room seemed to narrow around the weight of his attention. You stayed, he said quietly after reaching the final step. Eleanor's pulse stumbled painfully. Apparently, one corner of his mouth moved faintly. Not quite a smile. Something warmer. More dangerous. Martha watched both of them in silence before speaking calmly. The guests are beginning to wonder whether their host plans to appear tonight. Lucian's gaze never fully left Eleanor. Then perhaps we should stop disappointing them. The ballroom fell silent the moment Lucian entered beside Eleanor. Conversations faded one by one beneath towering chandeliers and candlelit balconies, while musicians lowered their instruments uncertainly. Every aristocratic face in the room turned toward them at once. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. Curiosity, speculation, judgment. She kept her chin lifted anyway. Lucian walked beside her with calm, effortless authority through the center of the ballroom floor, while whispers spread like wildfire across the crowd. That is the Whitgrave girl. I thought Hollowmere was favored. Apparently not anymore. Good Lord. He brought her publicly. Eleanor tried not to react. Beside her, Lucian seemed completely unaffected by any of it. Yet she noticed small things now. The faint tension in his jaw. The controlled stillness in his shoulders. He hated these rooms more than anyone inside them realized. You are staring too hard at the exits, she murmured softly beside him. His gaze flicked briefly toward hers. Occupational habit. You expect attacks at charity receptions? In aristocratic families? His mouth curved slightly again. Always. Eleanor nearly smiled before a familiar voice interrupted sharply behind them. Lord Ravenshire. They turned together. Beatrice Hollowmere stood near the ballroom entrance dressed in silver silk beneath diamond chandeliers glittering like ice above her pale hair. Eleanor blinked softly in surprise. Lucian went still beside her. Beatrice looked composed. Beautiful. Untouchable again. Yet something about her expression had changed since leaving Ravenshire Manor. Less cruel now. More tired. Miss Hollowmere, Lucian greeted quietly. Beatrice's eyes shifted briefly toward Eleanor before returning to him. I came because your mother invited me personally this afternoon. Eleanor's pulse slowed instantly. Lucian's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. My mother. Before Beatrice could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance drew every eye in the room. The conversations stopped completely this time. Even the musicians fell silent. Martha stood at the top of the grand staircase overlooking the ballroom below. But not as Martha anymore. The plain servant dress was gone. In its place flowed deep black silk edged with silver embroidery that caught candlelight like winter frost. Diamonds rested at her throat and wrists with quiet, devastating elegance. Her dark hair swept upward perfectly beneath the chandeliers while every inch of her carried unmistakable aristocratic power. The entire ballroom froze. Eleanor felt the shock ripple physically through the crowd around them. Good God! Someone whispered nearby. Lady Ravenshire. Lucian remained perfectly still beside Eleanor. Not surprised. Just tense. Watching his mother carefully. Lady Isolde Ravenshire descended the staircase slowly while silence spread across the ballroom thick enough to hear fabric rustling against marble floors. Aristocrats who had ignored servants all evening now stared openly at the woman they had overlooked for days carrying tea trays through Ravenshire Manor. Several faces visibly lost color. Eleanor watched everything with her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. Isolde reached the final staircase step gracefully before turning toward the silent crowd. "What a fascinating week this has been," she said calmly. Her voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom without needing volume. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Isolde's gray eyes swept slowly across the aristocratic families gathered beneath the chandeliers. "For 7 days I listened while some of you insulted servants directly to their faces. A few guests visibly stiffened. Others spoke kindly only when they believed power was watching." Her gaze paused briefly on several pale expressions near the orchestra balcony. "Very educational." Humiliation spread visibly through the ballroom now. Eleanor caught Mrs. Weatherby standing near the servants' corridor, watching everything with barely concealed satisfaction. Isolde continued calmly. "I pretended to be invisible." One corner of her mouth curved faintly. "Most of you made that remarkably easy." A nervous laugh flickered weakly somewhere across the room before dying instantly. Isolde's gaze shifted toward Beatrice next. "Miss Hollowmere." Beatrice straightened immediately. "My lady, you are intelligent, beautiful, exceptionally disciplined." Silence followed one heartbeat too long. "And profoundly cruel to people beneath your station." The words landed like shattered glass across the ballroom. Beatrice visibly flinched. Eleanor's chest tightened painfully for her despite everything. Isolde turned then, slowly, toward Eleanor. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Miss Whitgrave," she said softly. Eleanor suddenly forgot how to move. "You entered this house with nothing except dignity." Isolde's voice remained calm, certain. "You were insulted repeatedly, humiliated publicly, accused unfairly, tested constantly." Eleanor felt heat rush painfully behind her eyes. "And still," Isolde continued quietly, "you remained kind when nobody important was watching." Complete silence filled the ballroom. No music, no whispers, nothing except her voice. "You protected frightened servants. You helped repair damage you had no obligation to touch. You defended people with no power even while possessing none yourself." Eleanor looked down quickly, trying desperately to steady herself. Isolde's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And most importantly," her gaze shifted briefly toward Lucian standing beside Eleanor. "You made my son remember who he was before disappointment taught him fear." The words hit Lucian visibly. Eleanor saw it immediately. So did everyone else. Isolde finally stepped closer toward them both beneath the candlelight. "I spent years believing aristocratic marriages required perfection," she said quietly enough that only nearby guests could hear now. "I was wrong." Her eyes held Eleanor's steadily. "Families survive because of mercy, not appearances." Tears burned sharply behind Eleanor's eyes now. She blinked them back immediately. Isolde then turned toward the ballroom guests one final time. "For anyone still confused about my opinion regarding the future Lady Ravenshire." She stepped calmly beside Eleanor beneath the chandeliers and offered her arm publicly before the entire aristocratic assembly. "Allow me to clarify it completely." The ballroom remained utterly silent as Eleanor stared at her in stunned disbelief. Then slowly, carefully, Lady Isolde Ravenshire placed Eleanor Whitgrave's trembling hand onto her own arm like she was presenting royalty. And across the candlelit ballroom, Lucian Ravenshire looked at Eleanor with unmistakable love for the very first time in front of everyone. Nobody moved for several seconds after Lady Isolde Ravenshire placed Eleanor's hand upon her arm beneath the ballroom chandeliers. The silence felt almost sacred now. Shocked aristocrats stood frozen beside crystal glasses and silver trays, while candlelight flickered across stunned faces throughout the enormous room. Eleanor could barely breathe. Her pulse thundered painfully beneath her ribs while every eye in the ballroom remained fixed on her. Not with ridicule anymore. Something far more dangerous. Respect. Across from her, Lucien still had not looked away once. The expression in his eyes unsettled her more than the entire room, because there was no distance left inside it now. No restraint, no carefully controlled indifference. He looked at her exactly the way Beatrice described, like someone finally alive after years of surviving instead of living. "Music," Isolde said calmly into the silence. The musicians startled visibly before hurriedly lifting their instruments again. Soft violins filled the ballroom slowly while conversations remained hesitant and uncertain beneath the chandeliers. Nobody seemed entirely sure how to behave anymore, which amused Isolde Ravenshire enormously. Eleanor felt it in the faint satisfaction hidden behind the older woman's calm expression. "You planned this?" Eleanor whispered softly. Isolde glanced toward her without releasing her arm. "Of course I did. That is terrifying." One corner of Isolde's mouth curved faintly upward. "You sound like my son." Lucien finally crossed toward them through the ballroom crowd then. Guests immediately moved aside without thinking. Power followed him naturally. Quietly, Eleanor's breath caught again as he stopped directly in front of her beneath the candlelight. "Mother." Isolde looked perfectly innocent. "Yes. You humiliated half the county." "No," she released Eleanor's arm gracefully at last. "I merely removed their disguises." Lucien closed his eyes briefly like he had endured this behavior his entire life. "You could have warned me, and deprived myself of watching your face just now?" Isolde looked deeply offended by the suggestion. Eleanor nearly laughed despite the tension still twisting inside her chest. Lucien noticed immediately. His gaze softened dangerously. "There it is," he murmured quietly. "What?" "You stopped looking afraid." Eleanor looked away first this time because she suddenly could not survive the intensity in his eyes another second longer. Isolde observed both of them with obvious satisfaction before turning calmly toward a group of approaching aristocratic women near the ballroom edge. "Ah," she said lightly. "The vultures are regrouping already." Lucien sighed under his breath. "Please try not to start another scandal." "I make no promises." Then she disappeared smoothly into the crowd, leaving Eleanor suddenly alone beside him beneath the chandeliers and music. The ballroom continued slowly returning to life around them, though whispers still followed Eleanor everywhere now. Only differently. "They are staring again," she murmured quietly. Lucien looked completely unconcerned. "Let them. You say that because you are accustomed to power." No, his gaze remained fixed on her. "I say that because I am tired of pretending other people matter more than honesty." The words settled deeply somewhere inside her chest. Eleanor folded her hands carefully together, trying unsuccessfully to steady herself. "Your mother just publicly presented me to aristocratic society." "Yes. That does not frighten you?" Lucien's expression changed slightly, softer now, almost wondering. "No," Eleanor blinked softly. "Why not?" He stepped closer. "Not enough to scandalize anyone. Enough to change the air between them entirely. Because for the first time in years," he said quietly, "I want something more than I fear losing it." Her heart nearly stopped. Music drifted softly around them, while couples moved slowly across the ballroom floor beneath endless candlelight and silver winter decorations. Yet somehow Eleanor heard nothing except him. Lucien studied her face carefully now. Every flicker of emotion, every unsteady breath. "Dance with me." The request came so quietly she almost thought she imagined it. "Lucien, please." That word alone nearly undid her. Lucien Ravenshire did not sound like a powerful aristocrat when he said please. He sounded like a lonely man asking for something fragile, something real. Eleanor placed her hand into his before fear could stop her. Warmth closed immediately around her fingers. Steady, certain. He guided her silently toward the center of the ballroom while conversations softened again around them. Eleanor felt every pair of eyes following. For once she no longer cared. Lucien's hand settled carefully against her waist as music swelled beneath the chandeliers. "You are trembling," he murmured softly. "Your mother just changed my entire life in front of 200 people." One corner of his mouth moved faintly. That sounds exactly like her. Eleanor looked up at him then. Really looked. The exhaustion that haunted him since the beginning remained there faintly beneath his eyes. But something else existed now too. Peace perhaps. Or relief. Like he finally stopped fighting himself long enough to breathe. I almost left yesterday, she admitted quietly as they moved slowly across the ballroom floor. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly against her waist. I know. How? Because I spent the entire night terrified you would. The honesty in his voice struck harder than any dramatic declaration could have. Eleanor swallowed carefully. You should not say things like that to me. Why? She almost laughed at hearing his mother's exact question repeated back to her. Because I do not know how to survive men who sound sincere. Lucien looked at her with heartbreaking seriousness. Neither do I. Silence settled softly between them while they danced beneath golden candlelight. Eleanor suddenly realized everyone else in the ballroom seemed strangely distant now. Unimportant. There was only him. The warmth of his hand. The quiet steadiness in his breathing. The impossible tenderness hidden inside a man the entire county considered cold. My mother was right about one thing, he said after a while. What? His gray eyes held hers completely. This house changed after you arrived. Emotion rose unexpectedly sharp inside her chest. Lucien. No, he shook his head slightly. Let me finish before I lose courage again. Her pulse turned unsteady instantly. Around them, violins drifted softly through the glowing ballroom, while snow fell gently beyond the towering windows overlooking Ravenshire Manor. I spent years believing love made people weak, he said quietly. Because every version of it I witnessed eventually became selfish. Eleanor listened without breathing. Then you arrived. His hand remained steady against her waist. And suddenly kindness did not look weak anymore. Tears burned painfully behind her eyes. You defended servants while being humiliated yourself. You stayed during disasters that had nothing to do with you. You looked at broken people and saw human beings instead of inconvenience. His voice lowered further now. Roughened by emotion, he clearly was not accustomed to speaking aloud. And somehow you made me want to become someone worthy of that. Eleanor's vision blurred completely. She looked down quickly, trying desperately not to cry in the middle of the ballroom. Lucien gently touched one finger beneath her chin, lifting her gaze back toward his. Do not hide from me. The tenderness in his voice destroyed the last of her composure entirely. One tear escaped despite her efforts. Lucien looked at it like something sacred. I do not belong here, she whispered shakily. Not in families like yours. His expression softened into something devastatingly certain. Then perhaps my family finally became worthy of you instead. Eleanor actually laughed through tears at that. Quiet and breathless and disbelieving all at once. Lucien stared at her like he never wanted the sound to stop. Around them, the ballroom slowly faded away beneath candlelight and music and drifting snow beyond the windows. Nothing remained except the two of them standing impossibly close at the center of Ravenshire Manor, while years of loneliness quietly unraveled between them. There is still something I need to know, Eleanor whispered after a while. Anything. She searched his face carefully. If I had truly been ordinary. If your mother never revealed herself tonight. If society still looked down on me tomorrow. Lucien did not even hesitate. I would still choose you. The answer came instantly. Completely. No fear left inside it now. Eleanor felt her heart break and heal at the same time. Lucien touched her face gently then. Not possessive. Not desperate. Careful. Like she was something precious enough to ruin him if mishandled. You once told my mother invisible women are easier to hurt, he said quietly. I remember. His thumb brushed softly beneath the tears she failed to hide. I do not think anyone will overlook you again. Then finally, beneath crystal chandeliers and falling winter snow and the watchful glow of Ravenshire Manor, Lucien Ravenshire kissed her like a man who spent years starving for